Good afternoon, everyone. I'm not going to mic up for my intro, but if we can make a start this afternoon. A warm welcome to everyone. A warm welcome if this is your first psychology colloquium, and a sincere welcome to our speaker today, Professor Carey Morewedge. From Boston University, from the Questrom School of Business. This is the first psychology colloquium of term, and thanks to all of you for coming along. I'm aware this is for some people a slightly busy day, busy point in the academic calendar, but I'm very excited to present today's speaker. Carey did his PhD at Harvard University before moving on to a postdoc at Princeton and then faculty at Carnegie Mellon before taking his current position at the Questrom School of Business in 2014. He is very widely published in the leading journals: science, psychological science, management science, JP General, Journal of Personality and Social Psychology. He's won important awards, the Wegener Theoretical Innovation Prize from SPSP. And I'm particularly excited about his work bridging basic psychological mechanisms of decision-making with important applied relevance to many different fields. My own work on gambling, something we've been talking about this morning, but many other fields: sustainability, finance, behavioral economics, and today we're going to get an insight into some of that work on one-shot debiasing. Over to you, Carey. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me out. There's lots of people in the audience whose work I deeply admire, and it's a pleasure to share some of this new work with you. Today I'm going to talk about some work that I've been doing since about 2011, trying to see if we can improve decision-making through training. I'll apologize for sort of egregious characterization of BDT, but to just give you an idea of how I see this fitting into a broader literature, I think that in the study of judgment decision-making, much of it that sort of started in this area, you could think a lot of early work was trying to figure out how do we develop normative models of what is a good decision. You could think about work like thinking about things from an expected value framework would figure out how do we decide what's a good decision and what's a bad decision, whether it's from logic or from these kinds of probabilistic models. Then once those kinds of normative models have been established, people could start to think about whether or not people adhere to normative standards and use deviations from those kinds of normative standards to understand what kinds of biases people exhibit and what are some of the processes that lead to those kinds of biases. Later on in the research, there's a bit of pushback thinking about, well, are some of these biases often adaptive or useful? And that work was trying to think about sort of in what kinds of cases, why might people exhibit different kinds of cognitive biases, trying to see cases where they're adaptive and maladaptive and sketch out that landscape. And that sort of brought us to, that will bring us to sort of where we are now. We're thinking about how, I think people have, especially since maybe 2008, 2005, started thinking about how can we improve decision making. So are there ways, this work started earlier in the 80s, but we could think about, there's been a renewed interest in thinking about how can we improve decision making. And those kinds of improvements tend to take on three different kinds of forms. So from economics, the dominant perspective of thinking about how do we change or improve decision making is to change incentives. So if we think about people as rational actors and we think about them as motivated to pursue a utility, we can change people's behavior by changing the benefits and costs of engaging in different kinds of behaviors. So for example, if we wanted people to eat in a more healthier way or to adhere to a more healthy lifestyle, we could impose something on unhealthy foods like soda with a tax, right? And so you could think about a soda tax as an example of using incentives to disincentivize a particular behavior, in this case, consuming soda. And so in this way, we're changing sort of the costs and benefits of the problem. We're not changing sort of the psychological architecture of the problem, but sort of just the utility of engaging in different kinds of behaviors or the risks and stakes associated with them. Another kind of approach that's been very popular both in psychology and behavioral economics and some of the sustainability work that's going on here is thinking about we can change behavior through nudges. And so a different way, rather than changing the incentives that are associated with different kinds of outcomes, you could change the choices that people are presented with or the way information is presented to them. So, for example, rather than charging people more for soda, we could offer people different serving sizes of soda. So if you could think about New York City, for example, experimented with a ban on sugary drinks that were over 16 ounces. And so people could choose to drink more than 16 ounces of food, but by capping the serving size at 16 ounces, people would have to go back and buy more soda or drink 2 containers. And you think about the transaction disutility of drinking 2 containers, or sort of the implied normativity of a 16-ounce serving might lead people to consume less soda than they would if they could buy a 20-ounce container or 32-ounce container or a 64-ounce container as is sold in 7-Eleven. So one thing that's the final approach that I'll suggest that has been tried early in the 80s and 90s, and I will try to show you some evidence that I think it's worth picking up again, is this idea of training. And this is, can we educate people about things like cognitive biases? Can we educate consumers, citizens, policymakers, people in business firms about how to make better kinds of judgments and decisions? And so through training, can we actually teach people to recognize cognitive biases, become more aware of them, and make better decisions as a result? And so in this context, you would think about educating consumers about the incredible amount of sugar in each package of soda, or in each bottle of soda. So for example, you could tell them there's 12 packs of sugar in each bottle of soda. You would need 12 packs of sugar, so why would you consume this drink? So by making people aware of these kinds of these issues, you can reduce their susceptibility to this bias. So I think, for example, Tony has some work on stereotype threat, where you can inform people about its influence and see if that will reduce their propensity to exhibit it. So why is training theoretically interesting? So there's been a lot of work looking at stable individual differences in decision making and finding that they do tend to predict consequential behaviors. So Vondi Brundebrun, Andy Parker, and Baruch Fischoff have some very interesting work showing how different kinds of decision making skills can predict things like absenteeism in school, or different kinds of behavioral problems among adolescents. Colloquia et al. Has looked at different kinds of ways of numeracy predicting different kinds of biases and other kinds of consequential behaviors. Barb Mellers and colleagues have found that individual differences in decision making can predict people's ability to forecast future events, or their calibration about predicting different kinds of probabilistic events. And so if you think about individual differences as suggesting that reflecting sort of malleable differences between individuals, it suggests that maybe that we could have some kind of ability to improve people's decision making. So if we think about individual differences as being sort of stable kinds of anatomical differences in sort of brain architecture, that seems less malleable. But if we can think about them as maybe people have different kinds of skills or approaches in trying these kinds of decisions, maybe these kinds of stable individual differences will suggest that we can change people's decision making and change their consequential behavior. And so some evidence from that in the earlier literature was looking at whether or not we can achieve better decision making in specific domains. And so that early work found that we can improve people's decision making in tasks like predicting the percent chance of precipitation. So for example, weather forecasters become very well calibrated in predicting how likely precipitation is in the following day. But what was difficult about that kind of work is that you don't see that kind of transfer. And so the cases in which we do see transfer of training have been in cases where people come into people are given very intensive kinds of debiasing training courses, like taking a statistics course in graduate school, or undergoing sort of a professional degree. So for example, lawyers might be less susceptible to making logical errors. Psychology graduate students might be less susceptible to exhibiting different kinds of statistical biases. But sort of more limited kinds of interventions have been less successful. And so most of this work in training has looked at sort of in-the-moment debiasing, where you're providing people with mitigating strategies. But the question really has been lingering whether or not there's a possibility for engaging in training that would exhibit long-term improvements in decision-making. So the critique of these kinds of early efforts of training suggests that training requires massive amounts of effort. For example, the cases in which we have seen long-term improvements in decision-making are cases like college courses. The expertise that is gained in one particular domain doesn't necessarily transfer to new domains. So those weather forecasters, for example, who become accurate at predicting the % chance of probability, then when you give them the same kind of problems in a different format, so when you ask them how many of these general knowledge questions do you think you got correct, they show the same kinds of overconfidence as undergraduates. There's other cases from the business literature where, for example, realtors who have 7 years of experience are just as susceptible to anchoring effects when they see a list price of a home as undergraduates. You can see philosophers are as susceptible as undergraduates to different framings of the trolley problem in their decision about whether or not to kill 1 or 4 people. And you can see that physicians are as susceptible as patients to deciding between more or less risky kinds of choice medical treatments based on whether or not they're framed in terms of lives, the % chance of survival rates or the mortality rates. Right? So we see that these kinds of frames, whether it's in a moral domain, whether it's in a health domain, whether it's an anchor, all seem to have the same effects on experts as they do on naive undergraduates. And so the cases, that has certainly induced some reticence in the question about whether or not training might be effective. Training has been found to be effective in some domains, but critics point to these kinds of particular instances and suggest maybe it's a Hawthorne effect. So Richard Nisbet and colleagues were doing very interesting work in the 90s looking at debiasing interventions, but when they were trying to test the effects of the interventions, they would often remind participants of the debiasing intervention. So for example, before students had received statistics training were told before they completed a measure, think carefully about each problem and write down answers that are sensible to you. In many of the problems, you may find that the law of large numbers is helpful. So this sort of cue may remind people of the bias. And that may not necessarily be present in many kinds of cases where we want debiasing training to improve decision making. So there are many cases in which these reminders are absent. And a fourth critique has been that heuristics are actually adaptive in many kinds of cases, which has been an argument made by Gigerenzer and even Halarkis in the 90s. And so maybe by giving people debiasing information, maybe when we are actually reducing their quality of decision making, if they don't understand in which cases is this generalization adaptive, in which cases is this generalization ineffective. So the general consensus of the last sort of 30 years of debiasing training is that there have been minimal successes over the past 30 years. So from Fischoff's sort of 82 paper to more recent kinds of reviews of the literature on cognitive debiasing training, people basically assume that biases are like visual illusions, so people can recognize what a visual illusion is, but we're still susceptible to them, right? So even though most of us in this room recognize that the lines above are the same length, right, we're still susceptible to seeing those kinds of visual illusions when we observe the lines in conjunction. And so, for example, Daniel Kahneman, sort of one of the founders of the field, suggested that my position is that none of these things have any effect on system 1. You can't improve intuition, perhaps with very long-term training, lots of talk and exposure to behavioral economics. What you can do is cue reasoning, so you can engage system 2 to follow rules. Unfortunately, the world doesn't provide cues, and for most people in the heat of an argument, the rule goes out the window. So that's sort of a summary of sort of where we are at right now in terms of the field. And so I think the field has basically decided, or at least until recently, that sort of the earlier work of debiasing and the cognitive scheme was interesting, but not necessarily that applicable, and so it's focused more on nudges and incentives in terms of changing people's behavior. And so I would like to suggest that kind of post-mortem on debiasing interventions from a training perspective might be premature. Dale, you have a... Right, I'm not... So you're saying, the field says... Well, I would say both Kahneman and Thaler have argued that these kinds of training mechanisms are ineffective because we're not reminding people in the moment to use System 2, and System 2 doesn't seem to be spontaneously engaged after debiasing training any more than it would be before. So at best, sort of the perspective would be more similar to a like learner and Tetlock perspective, where when you make people accountable, they become more accurate if they know what rules to use. So we would need to make people salient, aware of biases in a situation for them to apply these kinds of rules. So, yeah, Aura?
It's interesting that you gave the example of the motor language that something you cannot train people. There are big cultural differences in distribution. And as far as we know, it's due to, if you grow up in an environment that's not carpenter, like where you grew up, the illusion goes down and completely skip in some cases. Is there evidence that you can train system?
I would agree with your general sentiment and suggest that maybe that's a improper kind of way of presenting it, but I think that that's been the way that people have been casting these kinds of cognitive biases. So maybe that's a bad example they're using, but that's their perspective is that as a culture we're viewing it this way. Maybe different cultures may have different cognitive biases, but there may be differences across cultures with cognitive bias, but I mean, the data, I mean, I think JDM has looked less at culture as a sort of moderator than other kinds of fields. There's been some work in endowment, some work in like correspondence bias, for example, but I haven't seen as much work in the cultural sphere as it would be in sort of like social psychology, for example. So let me return to your point at the end, and then. So I would suggest that the limitation of the current sort of approaches of nudges and incentives is that we're bending the world to fit the mind. So we assume that people have sort of a fixed cognitive architecture, and we have to change the choice they're presented with, or the different kinds of weightings that they should be making on different kinds of options. And these incentives and nudges can change the architecture and payoffs and judgments and decisions in a variety of different contexts, from like a corporate suite to a bodega, but they're also context specific. So the same criticisms of training being mostly context specific apply in many cases to nudges and incentives. So if, for example, a soda tax is affecting consumption of soda in a particular city, it's not necessarily transferring over towards candy. Or a default on oxytocin prescriptions necessarily might affect doctors' prescriptions for oxytocin, but it might not necessarily switch over to whether or not they give your child ADHD medication, right? So they're sort of both nudges and incentives are similarly context specific as devising and training. And so I'd like to share with you some work I've been doing in conjunction with IARPA, which is it's a subsidiary of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And during the Obama administration, they were very concerned about one of the largest intelligence failures to date in the US government, which was the decision to invade Iraq, which was predicated mostly on the decision that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. And so in a report to the President of the United States, they said in several instances when confronted with evidence that indicated Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction, analysts tended to discount such information, and rather than weighting the evidence independently, they accepted information that fit the prevailing theory and rejected information that contradicted it. And so this effort was based on this recognition that confirmation bias may have played a significant, obviously there are political factors involved too, but the confirmation bias may have played a substantial role in the decision that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction and the subsequent invasion of Iraq. And so the Office of the Director of National Intelligence convened several experts and decided to look at whether or not they could look at different kinds of training mechanisms through this serious program that could be reduced, whether or not 6 different kinds of cognitive biases that were prevalent and related to intelligence analysis could be reduced through training interventions. And so they were very interested in looking at different kinds of interventions, and so we tested both video-based instructional interventions and also a serious game. And so the 6 biases that were covered were confirmation bias, fundamental attribution error, the correspondence bias, blind spot, anchoring, representativeness, and projection. And so the structure of the program was a competition among 6 teams to develop individual difference measures for the 6 biases, and then to develop 2 serious debiasing games. So a serious game would be a video game in which people receive educational feedback about the biases in instruction. And then to test both long and short-term effects of the various interventions, both the games that the teams developed, so we developed two games, and also the videos that the government developed. And so I did this work in conjunction with a large research team of several academicians and also research assistants, but it was a combined effort across a number of different universities, also with a game design company and a defense contractor. And just to give you an example of sort of how we went through this, this project, we first had to figure out sort of scales to measure the bias across different kinds of time periods. So we generated items based on the literature, we conducted reliability analyses, we did exploratory factor analysis and confirmatory factor analysis of the scales, tested their face validity, also tested their discriminant validity and predictive validity. And just to give you an example of what the items looked like that we're measuring these biases on, we had a variety of different kinds of anchoring problems that were both self-generated and experiment-generated. So for example, we'd ask people, what's the duration of Mars' orbit around the sun in days? Right? With the, you could think about what your anchor would be. And so most people would start with the duration of Earth's orbit, right, which would be 365 days. Mars's actual orbit is 869 days. And so we would expect that people would exhibit anchoring to the extent that they gave an answer between 365 and 869. And so we would look at basically what's the proportional anchoring effect over between the anchor and the correct value. With regards to bias blind spot, we have a published scale. That's a condensed version of the scales that we used. It basically measures 14 different kinds of biases, and people evaluate the extent to which they exhibit the bias and the average citizen of their country exhibits the bias. For example, we could say some people show a tendency to judge a harmful action as worse than equally harmful inaction. For example, this tendency leads to think that it's worse to falsely testify in court that someone is guilty than not to testify that someone is innocent. And so we'd ask people, to what extent do you exhibit this bias? To what extent does the average American exhibit this bias? For confirmation bias, we use 6 different paradigms drawn from the literature. And they all looked at cases in which people searched for or evaluated evidence in a biased manner supporting a particular hypothesis. And so, for example, in this case is a multi-causal test strategy, sort of a multi-Q test strategy. So in this case, John noticed that his teeth had been looking whiter. He thinks that it might be due to an ingredient in his new toothpaste. He read the packet and learned that his new toothpaste contains sodium fluoride, triclosan, and glycerin. He thinks the sodium fluoride is making his teeth whiter. What toothpaste should he buy in order to determine whether his intuition is correct? And so the confirming example here would be to choose the toothpaste A with sodium fluoride, because right, you assume that that's the causal effect. And the disconfirming option would be to hold triclosan constant and glycerin constant and remove the sodium chloride. Okay, so for fundamental attribution error, we looked to the extent that people were making dispositional inferences about an actor's behavior rather that could be due to situational causes. So for example, Deborah had invited Peter to watch her class performance of Shakespeare's play, A Midsummer's Night Dream. After the show, Deborah and Peter were discussing the plot. During the discussion, Deborah had to correct Peter multiple times on important events that occurred during the play. Based on the information provided, how confident are you that Deborah is more knowledgeable than Peter? So this is a sort of trivia problem. And then for social projection biases, they define them as basically being false consensus and attributive similarity. And so we would ask people based on polling data, the extent to which they would be first asked a question like that differed across segments of Americans. Have you ever paid for digital music online? And then you make an estimate, what percentage of Americans do you think have ever paid for digital music online? And here we code whether or not they said yes or no, and then do they overestimate the percentage who agree with the percentage of Americans who exhibit the same behavior as they do. And then for the representativeness heuristics, we had 5 different kinds of representativeness heuristics: conjunction fallacy, base rate neglect, gambler's fallacy, law of small numbers, and then people's belief in runs. And so, for example, here's a conjunction fallacy example. So Angela loves puzzles, works on mathematical proofs in her free time, and plans to get a graduate degree in math someday. Which is more likely, Angela's a waitress, or Angela's a waitress who also tutors college students in geometry? So some of these biases were fairly simple. So for example, to uncover their structure. So for example, for fundamental attribution error and bias blind spot, they exhibited, even though we used, for example, 4 different kinds of paradigms for fundamental attribution error, they all loaded on a single factor. For bias blind spot, all the items loaded on a single factor. Some of the biases were more difficult, and we had to use formative scales. So confirmation bias basically didn't have a very simple structure, and so what we ended up doing for these kinds of, for confirmation bias, and also representatives heuristics, was to make different kinds of subscales based on paradigms, and then create a formative scale based on how people scored across the 6 different subscales. So for example, you can see with a confirmation bias, here are the 6 different kinds of paradigms we use, and we're gonna, I think we're gonna have a paper out on this in the near future. So you can see that sort of even waste and cards selection and waste and triplets problems, which are 2 paradigms based by the same author, basically correlate at 0.15. So there's very little agreement in terms of confirmation bias amongst the various kinds of instantiations that people have been using to measure it, and so these kinds of scales are a little more challenging to develop. And I'll return to that. I think it's important later on. But we do see people behave as the literature would predict that they should behave in these individual different measures. So for example, this is a sample of 661 M-Turkers, and we're asking them the extent to which they exhibit the bias, these different kinds of biases more or less than other M-Turkers. So 85% of M-Turkers believe that they are, the average M-Turker is more biased than they. Only one M-Turker thought that he or she was more biased than the average M-Turker. And so there's a pretty robust bias blind spot. In terms of their discriminant validity, we can see that these aren't simply mapping onto other kinds of biases. So we don't see, for example, this is a measures of bias blind spot, so the belief that you are biased. We don't see correlates at high levels with things like cognitive reflection or SAT math or verbal scores, or different kinds of subscales in the decision-making competence scale with different kinds of personality measures, self-esteem, superiority, need for uniqueness, narcissism, self-consciousness, self-monitoring, social desirability. So we do see each of these measures seems to have discriminant validity from other measures. And we also tested their predictive ability. So for example, in our correspondence bias measure, so correspondence bias would be, the framing of the question is leading me to either make more of a dispositional inference if it's asked about the person's traits, or about a situation if it's focused on the situation. And so here we're seeing whether or not people who are more likely to exhibit correspondence bias have a harder time parsing things like market performance from a fund manager's performance. So for example, if I am more susceptible to correspondence bias, if the market is doing well, do I attribute the success of the market to the manager? And if the market is doing poorly, do I attribute the success of the manager to the market to the lack of success of the market to the manager? And so we can see here that basically as people's propensity to make correspondent inferences increases, and these were in incentive-compatible choices that people were making where they had to bet money on different funds, we see that people are more likely to evaluate positively the fund manager who did well in a good market but underperformed from the market than a manager who outperformed the market in a time of loss. So these are showing sort of predictive validity of the phenomena that they should. So I just wanted to show you sort of what the scales look like and what they're doing before we get into the meat of how we did debiasing. Okay, so in terms of debiasing experiments, the basic design was we brought participants into the laboratory for about 3 hours. The first 45 minutes, they completed 3 different kinds of pretests. So we targeted 3 biases at a time. And so they would complete personality measures and also the three bias subscales. Then they were randomly assigned to receive a training intervention. So they either played our serious game or they watched a 30-minute video, instructional video designed by the government. These are now released on YouTube, so I'm happy to share that link with you if you're interested. And then participants completed a post-test in the laboratory for another 45 minutes where we measured again on different items their propensity to exhibit the same biases. So we have pre-test and post-test measures of these 3 biases on using different versions of the subscale. So we have 3 different versions and they're randomly assigned to receive A, B, or C at pre-test, post-test, or follow-up, and we swap the different versions. So you might receive ABC or BCA, et cetera. So this allowed us to do immediate testing of whether or not the intervention reduced their propensity to exhibit the 3 biases from pre-test to post-test. And then we also sent them later on a Qualtrics survey link for another 45-minute test that measured their long-term susceptibility to bias. So this was the 3rd battery of bias scales, and this was they received different items in this battery. And so this was either 2 or 3 months later based on the run that we did. And so now we could measure whether or not people, immediate debiasing effects of training would last over a 2 to 3 month period. Okay, so the government's video intervention was a 30-minute instructional video using examples of college students exhibiting the bias and then a narrator explaining the biases. So first the narrator defined heuristics and the 3 different kinds of biases. Actors illustrated real-world examples, and then the narrator suggested mitigating strategies. Again, I'm happy to share the YouTube link with you. Our debiasing games were first-person detective games. So the company that we worked with used to write sitcoms, so they're kind of like CSI-ish. But basically, I'll show you a clip and then walk you through how the game worked. This is an example of base rate neglect. Sorry, this is an example of base rate neglect.
Hey, have you seen Mary? 12H. By Carl's place. All class, 28, great wardrobe. Multiple museum memberships. Green bin, blue bin. She knows how to cycle. Anyway, since the owners are teaching how to gym ability, this provides an ongoing opportunity to challenge my grasp of human nature. Where to go for one's fitness program? Well, from what I can tell, there are only 3 options. 1, Rockies, 24/7 no-frills operation, about 5 minutes walk from the apartment. That's about 70% of attendance. 2, Entropy. Looks like a spa, even the guys have their nails done. It's about 10 minutes away. Around 10% of the building belongs. And they're sitting on your couch eating Chinese delivery and binge watching Netflix. That's about 20% of our happy village. So Mary, classy, definitely not a job. What fitness program do you think she'll sign up for?
So that's an example of an in-game problem, and then next will be the expert explaining it.
The second form of cognitive bias just experienced in the game segment occurs as a result of representativeness heuristic, which is a shortcut we use to make judgments and decisions about probability and chance events that leads to a number of different cognitive biases. The representativeness heuristic applies to many different kinds of judgments and decisions, and the biases that result take on several different forms. The biases mostly come down to using similarity to estimate probability. To illustrate a famous example, imagine Linda. She's 31 years old, outspoken, single, and very bright.
Sorry.
We asked you about which gym Mary, the new tenant, would join. Hey, have you seen Mary? 12H. Mike supplied a critical piece of information. About 70% of the building's tenants went to Rocky's gym. A smaller percentage did nothing. 10% belonged to Entropy, the upscale gym that was more like a spa. The statistical percentages are the base rate. Mary, in Mike's description of her, is the specific case. Your answer might not have taken the base rates into account. 70% of the tenants belong to Rockies.
So it's giving players individual feedback. And so to just give you the structure, during the gameplay, we're eliciting the 3 different kinds of biases through problems that are mapped out in the game. So for example, the problem above is a waste and card selection task problem, or it's based on that. And so people in this case are told, Stephanie has a theory that all green pills get shipped to Africa. Which boxes should you open to most efficiently test this theory? Well, if they look at the sort of disconfirming case would be looking at shipping to Denver, for example. So they look to see whether or not green pills are being shipped to Denver. So we're looking whether or not they're exhibiting the bias in this particular instance. Then at the end of the level of play, an expert explains what the bias is and mitigating strategies that people can engage in it. That's followed by narrative examples of professionals from policy or industry exhibiting the biases. And then people receive personal feedback based on their actual game choices and why the choices that they made either were biased or may have maybe suggestive of bias or maybe suggestive that they weren't biased based on these kinds of assumptions. And then afterwards, people received practice problems. So they had a chance to go through until they started. In the first game, we gave them a set number of practice problems. This example of base rate neglect. In the second game, we gave them adaptive practice problems until they started showing progress on the biases. So the first run that we did was looking at bias blind spot, confirmation bias, and fundamental attribution error. So we had about 278 participants recruited. About 240 of them were eligible for data analysis. And then 196 did all analyses. So of these participants, we did the bias pretest in the laboratory. We gave them a one-shot intervention, which was either the game or the video. Then they received the bias post-tests in the laboratory for the immediate effects of the debiasing training effects. And then we looked at 2 months later, we looked at the follow-up effects, so for the long-term effects of debiasing. And so what I'm going to show you first is their overall commission of bias. So higher scores would indicate more bias in this case. 100 would be, they gave all biased answers on the scales. 0 would be, they would give no biased answers on the scales. We're going to look at the average of the 3 scores, and then we'll look at individual biases as well. So in terms of, we also measured recognition of bias. So this is their ability to recognize and discriminate between the 3 biases. You can see both the game and the video produce large effects in both improving, this is flipped here, but improving their performance from pretest to, which would be in orange, to post-test and follow-up in terms of recognizing the different biases. So both the game and video had large immediate effects and the medium effects at follow-up. In terms of bias blind spot mitigation, we can see that both the game and the video had significant effects immediately and at follow-up for reducing participants' individual propensity to exhibit bias blind spot. The D on the game was about between like 0.9 and 0.8, and the D on the video was around 0.5. In terms of fundamental attribution error, we see similar large effects. So the game and the video both significantly reduced people's propensity to exhibit fundamental attribution error. So the D on the game was about 1 immediately and then 0.7 afterwards. And we can see a medium-sized effect for the video in terms of bias reductions. And then in terms of confirmation bias, we can see that both the game and the video significantly reduced people's exhibition of confirmation bias, both immediately and over the long term. Confirmation bias was very interesting because what we did in the game was we taught people about 3 of the different paradigms. So a Weiss and cart selection paradigm, the Scurgy multiple cause paradigm, and also a Snyder and Swan trait hypothesis testing paradigm. But we also, for the pretest, post-test, and follow-up, we also measured 3 other paradigms that were untrained. So we could see with confirmation bias whether or not the training in the game was just sort of teaching to the test, or whether it was generalizing to other kinds of paradigms that people hadn't encountered in the game. And so what we did find was, I'm going to show you both trained and untrained facets. So in terms of trained facets, we saw a larger immediate reduction than on the untrained facets for confirmation bias, but we found no differences at follow-up, and both reductions were significant. So in other words, it seems this evidence was the first that we saw that suggested that the training wasn't just teaching people to the test, but it was generalizing to other kinds of versions of the bias in different kinds of novel paradigms that people hadn't seen before. So this was really exciting for us. And just to see the overall mitigation that we saw, if we average the 3 kinds of biases together, we can see that the game is producing a pretty significant reduction in people's exhibition of the bias, both immediately and at the 2-month follow-up. We see like more than a full standard deviation reduction across the 3. Whereas the video is also producing a medium-sized reduction, which is, you can think about it, it's exciting because there's only a half hour of training that people are already seeing, and they're showing a substantial improvement. So the next experiment that we ran was looking at 3 different biases: anchoring, projection, and representativeness. And in this case, we extended the follow-up to 3 months later instead of 2 months later. And we recruited a similar number of participants. Again, unsurprisingly, the game and the video both taught people to recognize the biases, both immediately and at follow-up. But more interestingly, we found that both of them produced, again, significant reductions in people's exhibition of these different biases. So for anchoring, we see medium-sized effects for the game and the video, both immediately and 3 months later. For projection bias, we see larger effects immediately for the game and medium-sized effect later for both the game and the video. And for representativeness heuristics, we actually saw the largest reduction. So even the 30-minute video was producing almost 2 standard deviations in reduction of people's exhibition of representative heuristics. And so this may get at some of the questions of, like, do people, in some cases like anchoring, you have to figure out, sort of learn how to correct from your answer. That may be a more difficult kind of task for people to do than something like representative heuristics, where you learn about the conjunction fallacy once, and then you learn not to do it again. And so there may be some interesting future research trying to figure out which kinds of biases are easier to ameliorate. Are biases of correction, like anchoring, or biases of just using a different rule, like representative heuristics. Again, the overall effect sizes were pretty large for both the game and the video. We saw more than a full standard deviation reduction for the game, both immediately and at follow-up 3 months later. And for the video, we saw a large effect initially and later on as well. So these training mechanisms are now being used by the U.S. intelligence services to improve the quality of our intelligence analysis. But we've been doing some more work as well, looking to see whether or not there are other ways that we can use training interventions and the applicability of those training interventions to new problems. So recent work that we've been doing is seeing whether or not the training that we're doing is pretty intensive. It's hard to get a classroom, for example, to, like, if you had a lecture group of 100 people and you want to debias them, it'd be hard to get all 100 people to do the game. But in many kinds of cases, like in medicine or in theater, people will do things like hot seat training, where one person will receive feedback and other people will see the feedback they received. And so an interesting question we were wondering is whether or not observational learning might work similarly, as people can basically become biased by watching other people. Can we also debias them by watching other people as well? So if they see a social model engaging in the behavior, can we reduce their propensity for bias as well? And so what we did here was we basically did a direct replication of the second experiment, but we added 2 conditions. We had a no training condition where people simply just took the pre-test and post-test so that we could measure practice effects of taking the tests twice. And we also added a condition in which people observed another player play the game in real time. So they were basically sitting at a cubicle, their monitor was mirroring someone else's monitor, and they didn't know who they were watching, right? And so we could see whether or not people are learning from observing the mistakes and feedback that someone else is receiving as well. And so we did find, I'll show you the overall bias reduction. We did find that, again, we replicated the large effects with game and video interventions at the immediate debiasing, but we also see that observational learning seems to have a pretty profound effect. So seeing someone else engage in the different kinds of questions and receive feedback seems to produce a large debiasing effect as well. Of course, this experiment, people also saw the information that was embedded in the video, and so we wanted to run a more narrow, tighter controlled study to see whether or not observational learning alone would help reduce these kinds of biases. And so we did a new study where we had people perform 2 tasks, and they could receive up to 2 kinds of different training. So in the first task, they judged a set of 10 objects. Then they received training on how to improve their judgments. And then in the second task, they judged another set of 10 objects. And so they either received no training, we taught them a rule to improve their judgment, they observed someone else using that rule without information, or they received both the rule and saw the other person implementing the rule. And this was run on Amazon Mechanical Turk, and the training basically took about 5 minutes. So we used a weight-on-advice paradigm. Participants were shown 10 different objects. They're asked to initially guess the weight of the object. We used objects from like an Italian boutique store, so people couldn't just Google it. And so they were given the dimensions of the object, and they were simply asked to guess the weight in pounds. And they give a numerical answer. Then afterwards, they would receive the advice of another participant, and they're asked to make a final estimate. So for example, you might see your initial estimate was X pounds. The estimate of another person was 3.8 pounds. What is your final estimate? And so what we would do is they repeated this 10 times. And so what we did was we modulated the advice. So we used a formula that basically created, bracketed the correct answer with the advice with a jittering function on it for noise. And so that if participants we wanted to see whether or not they would use advice at all. And so we could test whether or not participants improved their answer by incorporating the advice that they received. So in their second estimate. And so participants who were taught the rule were taught about an averaging rule. So typically in these kinds of weighted on advice paradigms, if you and another person make a numerical estimate of a particular object where you have independent judgments, averaging your estimate with the other person is going to improve your result. So for example, if Kate and I are making different estimates about the weight of the teapot, right? If I average my estimate with Kate's after I learn her estimate, that's going to improve the quality of my own estimate. So this kind of averaging rule works because typically you can think about if people are randomly drawn from a distribution, averaging should generally improve their estimate towards the correct answer. And in the observational learning condition, they simply saw someone using an averaging rule for 5 of the estimates. So they basically saw a video where another person was observing the object and then gave an estimate. Okay, so that's an example of that. Okay, so we did 2 calculations in terms of their judgment. So to what extent do they exhibit weight on advice? So to what extent was their revised estimate minus their initial estimate a reflection of the advice minus the initial estimate? So how much did they update their judgment? And you can see that both pure observational learning and information did have a medium-sized improvement on the extent to which people were incorporating weight on advice in their estimates. But the combination of both information and observational learning improved their estimates more. So it seems like there's a unique effect of seeing someone else engage in modeling of the behavior to improve people's judgments. And we also looked at whether or not their absolute judgments improved too. And so there we again see that both observational learning and information improved people's estimates, but the combination of the two was greater than either alone. Okay, so so we can see different kinds of methods of debiasing are working in the laboratory. The last question that we wanted to really investigate was whether or not these kinds of debiasing training interventions would generalize to more kinds of field cases. And so we had the fortune of having the administration of HEC Paris, which is a business school in France, allow us to offer all students in 3 different kinds of professional programs access to the debiasing intervention. So we allowed them to play in one of 20 different sessions the first debiasing game that we created that targeted confirmation bias. And so what these students were allowed to do is sign up for this intervention. Almost all of them did sign up to do the intervention. And what we did was we surreptitiously included a business case into each of their courses, Carter Racing, that we used to measure their susceptibility to confirmation bias later. And so the average duration between when participants received training and when they received the course case was about 18 days. but we use natural variation in the scheduling to basically assign people to trained or untrained conditions. So in other words, some participants completed the debiasing training after the course case was administered. Some of them did it before, and we didn't debrief them until everyone had finished the debiasing training, so all the sessions had ended. And so we had 318 participants that we invited. 316 signed up for the intervention, and 290 said that they were unfamiliar with the case, but the results hold if they or people who didn't show up for training ever are removed as well. And so what we found was really exciting. We found that there was a 29% reduction in people's propensity to engage. So let me explain, to engage in, to choose a confirmation hypothesis consistent outcome. So let me explain to you what card racing does. Basically, it's a problem where you're the head of an automotive racing team, and there's a concern that the temperature of the race will induce engine failure. So you've been tracking over the course of several races, cases in which there have been engine failures and cases in which there have been no engine failures. And so your engineer has presented this information to you, and it's available in 2 different graphs. And if you inspect either graph individually, it's hard to see the correlation between temperature and engine failure. But if you aggregate the 2 graphs together, you'll see that there's a very clear relationship between temperature of the race start and engine failure. So at the cold start that the race would begin at, engine failure is nearly certain. And so the case is basically modeled on the decision to launch the Space Shuttle Challenger, where engineers at Norton Thiokol were trying to convince NASA to abort the mission, abort the launch because of the cold temperature at which the O-rings were likely to disintegrate, which they did, right? And so the people who read the case sort of at a more superficial level will see that the case suggests to most people that the expected value of racing is particularly high unless you take this temperature concern into account. And so if you engage in a cursory examination of both graphs, you might think that the temperature information is inconclusive and sort of base your judgment on the expected value absent those temperature considerations. So what we're looking at here is whether or not people are likely to decide to race at that low temperature or decide not to race. And as you can see, the majority of participants who were untrained decided to race at that time, whereas there's a significant reduction in the propensity of trained participants to decide to race. And these were individual decisions that participants made. And then afterwards, what we asked them to do was to justify their decision, and we coded those decisions for instances of confirming, disconfirming, and neutral arguments for racing. And so we found that basically there was an effect of training on the propensity to engage in confirming and disconfirming arguments. But when we look at this, basically the reduction in the propensity to engage in confirming arguments among trained participants explained their reticence to race. So in other words, the training seemed to reduce people's propensity to make arguments in favor of racing and to choose racing, and seemed to have a substantial 29% reduction in their propensity to race. And this holds when we control for things like their work experience, English proficiency, cognitive reflection, their grade point average, their graduate management admissions test. So it doesn't seem like it's a selection effect where better students are signing up earlier and receiving training, and worse students are waiting later and receiving training later. And just because we were concerned about the selection biases as well, we looked at smaller slices of the data. So we also had samples of participants who received training 3 days before or after the case was administered. And so you'd think that if selection biases were a concern, people who took the training in this tighter window would be less susceptible to that. If the training effect was bigger, then we'd expect it to be a larger effect. And so you can see that there's a significant effect between trained and untrained participants, whether we look 3 days before and after, 2 days before and after, or even 1 day before and after. So all of these kinds of windows find a significant effect. Okay, so in sum, I think this research is really interesting because it addresses the 4 major critiques that people have leveled against debiasing training. Some of the critiques have suggested that debiasing training requires massive effort. In other words, you have to take a graduate seminar in statistics, for example, or undergo a professional degree in psychology in order to exhibit these kinds of reductions in cognitive biases. we find medium to large reductions in the propensity to exhibit these cognitive biases with a 30 to 60 minute intervention. We're only looking at 2 to 3 months later, but we do see substantially large effects, much larger than observed in the previous literature. We see significant effects even with a 5-minute intervention on the weight on advice task. The second argument is that the expertise doesn't transfer to new problems and domains. We see transfer to new paradigms and contexts in the case of confirmation bias. So we're teaching people about free paradigms of confirmation bias. We see transfer to untrained paradigms as well. In the case of the card erasing case, people are learning about confirmation bias in 3 basic paradigms, and we're seeing transfer to the more messy case kind of format, which people are untrained in. We see the third critique is that trained participants are reminded of bias when tested. So we find that debiasing works when people are not reminded that their biases are being measured. And a fourth critique, which I think is a reasonable one, is that heuristics are often helpful, and so people may not know when to apply debiasing training to these kinds of cases of where heuristics might be adaptive or maladaptive. And so our evidence from card erasing, where people are improving their decision making by choosing the optimal case outcome, suggests that this kind of debiasing training can improve decision making in cases where it's necessary. I think some of the implications of this work as we go forward is that a lot of people have asked sort of why is debiasing training working in these kinds of cases and having such a big effect where it may not necessarily work in previous instances. And I think that a lot of the previous failures may have been due to the measures rather than the interventions. So we see pretty strong effects on our scales with very simple kinds of interventions. And I think the reality of it is making individual differences scales for biases have been less exciting to researchers than finding biases. And so the work to do that, to develop those scales and validate them and show their discriminant and predictive validity takes a lot of time, particularly in cases like confirmation bias or representativeness heuristics. And so fewer people have been working on those kinds of scale development problems than on sort of identifying biases. And I think that some of the problems in the previous literature in finding these kinds of debiasing effects have been on what kinds of scales are they using, or like looking at one-shot behavioral outcomes. I also think that these kinds of individual differences generalize to other biases relying on the same psychological process. So for example, in our case of bias blind spot, we also see that bias blind spot predicts the extent to which people show better than average and worse than average effects, because they tend to map onto the same kind of use of evidence for making decisions. But we don't see strong correlations even within confirmation bias amongst different kinds of facets. And so an interesting proposition that this research may suggest is that people don't really have a generalized decision-making ability. They may have things like numerosity, where they're better or worse at doing different kinds of mathematical tasks, or they may be better or worse at statistics. But many of the different kinds of decision-making biases that we're testing don't map onto like a general decision-making ability. And I think this resonates with some of the earlier work that Van de Bruyn and colleagues were doing, where they found that fluid intelligence was the best predictor across different kinds of biases of whether or not people would be susceptible to one bias, rather than other kinds of decision-making problems. And sort of the next big questions in this literature is sort of going beyond the kitchen sink. So we didn't think that this kind of training program would work. We thought it was an exciting problem, and we're willing to give it a shot. So we sort of threw everything we could into the games. And we don't really have a clear idea of why they're working in this case. We sort of tried everything that we could. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in figuring out when does debiasing work, and like what needs to be present for debiasing to work. Looking at are different kinds of biases easier to reduce. So we do see differences in terms of people's ability to show, or in terms of our reduction of anchoring, for example, in representative heuristics. And so it's possible that some kinds of biases of correction are easier than are more difficult to reduce than biases of applying the wrong kind of rule to a problem. But it's also possible that differences in terms of the scales are due to those problems. We can also think about when is it better to debias people. So I think a question that might be interesting for someone like Liz would be, do debias people make better decisions, right? So if we debias people in terms of things like affective forecasts, right, are they making better decisions that make them happier? And lastly, sort of if we can debias people, in terms of their decisions, for whom should we debias, right? So if people have different kinds of perspectives on outcomes in the future while they're experiencing them and while they remember them, like who is the person that we should debias decisions for? So in some earlier work, I looked at like how people think different phases of utility contribute to the pleasure one derives from experiences, and whether people are thinking about a short experience like a kiss, or a long experience like a day at work, or a holiday with their family. People tend to load most of the contribution to utility on their experience rather than on anticipation and retrospection. And so people may have different kinds of beliefs about how we should debias people if we're thinking about improving their well-being. So in summary, I think this is encouraging for people in our profession because we're studying all these biases, and it's not just for entertainment, so we can actually improve people's decision making. You don't quit your day job. And it's encouraging because these debiasing trainings interventions, even one-shot interventions, seem to have large effects improving judgment decision making both the short and long term. And I don't think that we should stop using nudges and incentives, but I think that this work suggests that training is a tool that we can use to add to that toolkit and think about it as a way to supplement nudges and incentives in cases where policymakers or market forces are not commensurate with implementing nudges. Okay, thank you.
Excellent talk, thank you. This is open for questions.
So I want to go back to the mechanism question that you alluded to right
Sure.
at the end. And it's a two-part question, both of them end up being about mechanisms. So going back to the Kahneman quote that you started with, do you feel that this intervention is meeting that challenge of actually training System 1? Or do you think that, by and large what you guys are doing is really allowing people to sort of be more persistently in a kind of System 2 where they can catch the right context, right? So for example, what would happen if most of the tasks that you were doing in the post-test were under extreme time pressure or with some sort of an extreme incentive structure to get the answers right and very quickly or to avoid some sort of punishment?
Sure, I think that's a great question. I give you a speculative answer. I don't think that we're changing people's intuitive associative structures in the course of 5 minutes or 30 minutes or 90 minutes. So it seems more logical to me that we're increasing the propensity to engage in reflection. The only evidence that I have for that is in our study of observational learning. The first study, we did measure people's bias recognition in the observational learning conditions and found that the greater the improvement in people's ability to recognize and discriminate between the three biases, the greater the reduction in their commission of the biases from pretest to post-test. But that could also be like a ceiling effect. So if you already recognize the biases or if you already don't commit them, like people who are really bad at everything have more room to improve than people who are not. But that, I would certainly go with the latter. But I think it's a great question, and it's not something that we have data to answer, but it's certainly an open.
Let me quickly follow up.
Yeah.
So, I took the Kahneman quote as sort of saying that, great, System 2 interventions exist, but ultimately they're not going to be scalable and all that usable because in the end, the real life context in which people are making decisions are not going to be consistent with the kinds of trainings, right? So do you feel that maybe that's not the right way to think about it and these kinds of interventions actually should have very long-term beneficial effects? Or do you think that, maybe there really is a way to do System 1, you don't know yet if this is doing it, or what do you,
Yeah, I think honestly we're still at the stage, at least in this work, with existence proofs. Like, can we do this? And I think that that's important to do and probably show generalization across a number of different kinds of cases. So does it happen in medicine? Does it happen in finance? Can we do this in other kinds of contexts? And then see sort of under what circumstances is it more or less effective? And the most promising data in this talk that I think sort of suggests that's possible is a case study where we're not reminding people of the training that they received. The case is delivered by a different experimenter by their instructor in a course context. And so we're still seeing that the training is having some effect on trained participants. It's not eliminating everyone choosing that option, but it's having a significant reduction in their propensity to exhibit that. And so I think that's promising and it's worth investigating, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in this area, and certainly interventions that remind people of biases and explain biases to them, like the in the moment debiasing has been shown to be helpful in a variety of different kinds of cases, like beyond sort of like questions of academic performance. You could look at also questions about like financial decision making. So a lot of sort of financial decision making training has been targeted towards these in the moment kinds of interventions. But I think the question of how do we develop interventions that affect people when they're not reminded later on is still sort of is kind of like a Wild West, and it's, you know, we have speculative answers to that, but nothing concrete.
Thanks so much for a very interesting introduction to this topic. And I wanted to ask, to what extent, I guess all of your work has to do with individual, targeting the individual in terms of changes. And given that a lot of our contingencies that we pick up from the world have to do with the social world we're in, including what we consume, including who we talk to and the information we get, to what extent is it also helpful to consider interventions that flip your first point here, that we're trying to adapt the world, which we create in many definitive ways, to the biases that exist in order to debias the world, in essence ending with better decision making. So the concrete example of that is the things that we're surrounded with in terms of buying at the store and eating and consuming and so forth. Given that there's, in your experiments, which are very successful at modifying it, do not distinguish between system 1 and system 2. So assuming that system 1 picks up contingencies in the world with particular regularities that we evolve to have, is there any attempt to think, how can we construct what we feed into system 1, socially speaking, in order to debias it?
Well, I think there's lots of promising work that suggests that we can, looking at nudges and incentives and changes in norms. I would think like Margaret Tankard has a really interesting paper with Betsy Levy-Palak where they're looking at even the Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage and like attitudes in the US towards gay marriage before and after the ruling. And there you have like a normative legal intervention and it's changing people's attitudes, you know, having it sort of immediate, like has a substantial effect on people's attitudes before and after. And a lot of the work on nudging is doing the same. So going back to the question of like opiate prescriptions. So if you reduce the number of pills, that's the default for doctors to prescribe, I believe it's for Oxycontin, you see a pretty substantial reduction in the number of pills prescribed overall. So we can think about, those are cases where you're giving people a norm, a default or a law, right? And it's changing people's behavior on a social level. So I think I'm very grateful to see many cases where like those kinds of norm changes do affect real behavioral change. I think the more sticky issue has been, can we change people within person across these kinds of contexts? And so I think it's promising that we see both kinds of change, of a normative change and also individual. Sorry. Dave?
Yeah. So you were saying how comparing with why didn't this work before, maybe it was because it was bad measurement, right? People didn't scale. But thinking a bit beyond the kind of JDM biases and thinking about like energy efficiency and diet, there's just a ton of studies where what they're measuring is real world eating stuff and real energy, and I don't want to think you want to say they're measuring the wrong thing, right? There's tons of data. And I've been reviewing the literature on it, and there's just overall education doesn't do much is kind of the finding, right? Which makes what you're doing really impressive, and I just was hoping to dig in a little bit more on your intuitions about why what you're doing is working in all these other domains where education doesn't do much, and is it because what you're doing is cognitive and it's more affective, it's about you and other things, or is it because what you're doing is just better done? You have these games, these videos, and you did a good job, and the previous ones, you do the sugar packets or whatever, who cares? Or is it because what you're doing has a right answer, right? And maybe
Yeah.
I mean, there's a ton of things, obviously, but I was just curious if you've thought about this and why you think what was the magic.
Yeah, I would say the most relevant example for me, like contextually, is we've been undergoing at BU a lot of, we're trying to increase the diversity of the faculty. And there is a case where people have social biases, right? And that seems, people feel much more reticent to acknowledge the fact that they have social biases and address them than these kinds of cognitive biases. And I think there's sort of a cluster of biases that we would think of as like social, maybe a cluster of biases that we think about as cognitive. I think people view themselves as being, people are more reluctant or show more reactance to acknowledge the fact that they exhibit social biases than cognitive biases. Like if someone said to you, well, Dave, like you showed confirmation bias, like your decision to buy a gasoline at this gas station was like a total confirmation bias, right? That's something that you're okay with. Or you're like, your decision to hire this candidate was kind of racist. Like that's not something that most people would feel good about, right? So there's different kinds of evaluative feedback on the self for making mistakes in those cases too. And I think there's another layer, and we were talking a little bit with Luke about this morning for breakfast, is there's also a question about, in many cases, things that we call biases could be also construed as preferences. So if we look at discounting problems, for example, and we say, look, these people are crazy, like why don't they wait a week for $1? Like, right? Like the interest rate on that is insane. That's clearly like they're biased. No, that could be a time preference, right? So there are some people who, don't believe they'll live till tomorrow, and if you have that belief, then taking $10 now makes sense, right? Or if you wait till death to spend all of your money, like that's irrational too, right? So, there's a question of separating what's sort of a cognitive bias. Like what do we mean by cognitive bias? What do we mean by biases? Do we mean like errors in fault, like moving from normative models? Do we think about things that like have social or individual health implications? Do we think about cases where there's some kind of like negative implication for someone else? So is the mistake on me? Is the mistake on affecting someone else? Or is the mistake just something that's more abstract? And so people I think there's a lot to peel back there in terms of people's amelioration to like, or their openness to like investigating these biases and improving their judgment in these different kinds of domains.
Or just get carried away from training.
Or if you like make it more abstract, yeah.
The right area.
Yeah.
Two questions further back.
Sure.
I'm curious to your thoughts on why the games used to work better than the video. I think the first answer that came to my mind was kind of like depth of processing, right? It's more active, which takes like something like taking notes on the video, and I should have stayed with that. Or do you think that there's a qualitative difference in the first person aspect of it, and that you're putting yourself into these situations, and then that's easier to recall or somehow helps better, but you're doing the same thing?
I think that's a great question. In the first study of the observational learning, we tried to parse that, right? So we had people playing the games and receiving direct feedback, and people watching them play the games, and also seeing the feedback they received. And so the game instantiated a larger debiasing effect than observing the game player. But I do think that there's benefits to feedback. And in the early Fishoff 82 paper, actually, feedback seemed to be one of the few things that seemed to have some credible evidence. So, we did try to, the game really walks people through the different kinds of biases that they're exhibiting. And it sort of gives you a chance to test yourself and also learn how to use it, learn sort of why you're making the mistake, and gives pretty personalized feedback in that case, which is something that the video didn't do. A different question is the video is also 90 minutes in the game, the game is 90 minutes and the video is 30 minutes, so we don't have them matched in that case. But we did try to do that kind of matching more with the observational learning studies as well. But if you're interested, the video is available on YouTube from the IARPA channel, and we also have copies of the game for like an educational license. I don't have any profit from it, but people have been using it in like some MBA classes.
I think we need to vacate the room at 10:02, so I'm going to take one more question from.
In the lab or in the field study, I don't misheard you, but I think you said that the training was about like cold starts for engines, and then also.
Sorry, the case was about cold starts for engines.
Oh, I thought you said the training was.
No, so the training is about confirmation bias. It's the same game as in the first study, and the case is about cold starts for engines. It's modeled on the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster.
Okay, I think I might have misheard you then. My question doesn't apply anymore.
Okay.
In that case, there's a very quick question. Aaron. I have a question about, I want to ask you about expertise. So, I mean, if you can't get people to really get the bias and much from the training, surely expertise should have massive effect
Yeah.
But in the beginning of the talk, you said there are lots of studies where you don't find exclusive effects. I'm just curious, when do we know more about when does exclusive matter and when doesn't matter?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question as well. My speculative answer, which is what I could offer you at this point, is that when we're teaching people about these biases, we teach about the bias at an abstract level. So we give them a definition of confirmation bias. We also use a variety of different kinds of paradigms to elicit that bias and give them feedback, and many different practice problems and narrative examples from different domains in which people show the bias. And so if you think about like a basic learning rule principle, we're giving them the abstract rule and showing them how it maps onto many different kinds of contexts and domains. Whereas if I'm a weather forecaster, I'm learning how to make probabilistic judgments about precipitation, but no one's teaching me how to like map that rule onto like a confidence judgment, right? And so experts like philosophers or realtors or doctors maybe gain expertise in like understanding the probability of different kinds of surgical outcomes, but like they may still be susceptible based on framing because you're not teaching them about framing effects. And so you may need to teach people about the more like meta rule or abstract rule that would be applied in all these different kinds of contexts. But that's a speculative answer that I don't have concrete data to. But that would be my intuition.
On which note, I would like to thank Carey once again.